Everybody, this is Dream, and we have a nice National Hockey League slate here. It's a pretty decent slate, quite a few games, but I think we have a lot of good value options today on this particular slate. Some slates don't seem like they have as much value, but I felt like today there's quite a bit. I'm going to start with goalies and then work my way through there. Before I get started, though, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? I really do appreciate it. Okay, so for goalies, you got to make sure to check close to the slate that the guys that I have listed are confirmed. If they aren't confirmed, then obviously you don't want to roster them, and those are subject to change throughout the day. So you want to, check that, within an hour of the slate starting or whatever, around 6 Eastern. So let's go and get into the goalies I do like though. The first guy I'm going to look at is Alexander Georgiev. I don't know how. I apologize for butchering names. I'm going to butcher a lot of these guys. Anyway, he's averaging about 16 fantasy points a game. He's had some really good games. He's had a couple off ones, but he's doing really well, and his ceiling is probably around 42, 43 points today. Then we're going to look at Connor Healy Buck. This dude has averaged about 19 fantasy points per game. He's had some really big games. He's had a few bad ones, but overall, most of the time he's been doing good. He's actually on a 3-game win streak as well, so he's been doing really solid from that perspective. And he is got a 42 to 43 ceiling as well. Then we're going to look at Tristan Jarry for Pittsburgh here. Now, his average is around 18 a game, and he does have a ceiling in the mid-30s, though he hasn't been particularly great the last couple starts that he's played. So, the last 4 actually he's played, but he still has a lot of upside in this matchup, and so I do like him here, but he is a little bit risky because he hasn't been very good lately. And then Craig Anderson here for Buffalo here. His price point's a little bit cheaper. He has averaged about 17 this season so far. He's only started 4 games, as you can see, so his ceiling is around 30, 32, 33. And he's had 3 wins in those 4 games. So if he can get a win, he'll likely pay off here. But that's going to be the thing. And obviously we got to make sure he ends up playing here. Then we're going to look at Jordan Binghamton for St. Louis. He's the cheapest goalie I like today. He's averaging about 17 points per game, and he has a ceiling in the mid-30s as well. He had a couple really bad losses, and he's giving up more goals and stuff than some of the other goalies here. Obviously, his price point's a lot lower, but he is still got good potential to have a good scoring game here. So that's what I have at goalie. Let's go and get into the centers now. So first, we're going to start off with Sidney Crosby at $8,800. He's the most expensive guy I have on the slate. Obviously, he's a great player. He's averaging about 19 fantasy points per game. And his ceiling is in the mid-40s. He's been pretty solid lately. He hasn't had any huge giant games for a little while, so he's kind of due for one. And he definitely has a good matchup here to potentially do that in. Then we're going to look at Sebastian Aho here for Carolina. Now, he's been averaging about 16 fantasy points a game, and his ceiling is in the 35 to 38 range. He's actually had some really big games lately. But he's had some bad ones as well. But he's playing consistent amount of minutes and stuff like that. So I think he's in a great spot here. And make sure that that's the center, Sebastian Aho. Jack Eichel for Vegas. He looks like he's in a pretty good spot here. His average is around 17, and he has a pretty high ceiling at about 44. And as you can see, even the last game, he had 56 fantasy points. So he definitely has the capability. He's really not had many bad games lately. He had a couple of bad ones back in October, but overall he's been good and really consistent for a while. Evgeny Malkin for Pittsburgh. He's another guy I like today. He's averaging about 17 fantasy points a game, and his ceiling is in the low 40s. He hasn't had a huge, massive game so far this season, but he is except for, I guess, the 3rd game of the year. But he's been pretty decent. He hadn't had too many real terrible games. I expect him to have a good game here today. And then we're going to look at Scheifele, S-C-H-E-I. There he is. Mark Scheifele, I don't know, Scheifele or something like that, at Winnipeg. Now he is averaging 15 fantasy points a game, and he has a ceiling of around 40. Aside from the first game of the season and the last game they just played, he really hasn't really met his potential. But he has some opportunity here. He's going to have plenty of minutes, and he should be a guy that can take advantage of that situation today. And he's a nice cheap price point. Then we're looking at Trocheck, Vincent Trocheck for the Rangers. Now he is an interesting spot. His average is pretty low at about 11 fantasy points a game, but he is got a ceiling in the mid-30s, and so I do think he is in a pretty good spot here. He is kind of boom or bust, but I do think he's a good value play if you want to go with a value play here. And then Anze Kopitar for the Kings. He's averaging about 13 fantasy points per game, and he has a pretty high ceiling at around 45. I think he's got a higher ceiling for the cheap end guys than a lot of the others, but he has been some inconsistency with his scoring. But again, he has really good upside, so he's somebody to take a look at today. And then Elias Lindrum here. He's only $5,300, and he's averages in the 15 to 16 range when he gets good minutes, and his ceiling is in the mid-30s, so I think he has some upside in this matchup. So that's what I like at center today. Then we're going to look at the wings, and we're going to start with Brad Marchand. Now he's the most expensive wing I like today at $8,200. He's got an average around 18, and he's got a ceiling in the mid-40s. He hasn't met that yet this season. He had it real close against Detroit in the first game of the year. He hasn't played a ton of games yet, but he's a good player, and he should be able to execute well in this particular matchup. Then we're going to look at Jake Gutenzell. Now, he's an interesting spot. He's averaging about 17 fantasy points a game, and he's got a ceiling in the low 40s. Again, he hasn't met the 40s yet, but he has had some near 30, and I expect him to have a really solid game tonight. Then we're going to look at Philip Forsberg here at $7,100. His average is around 17 as well. He actually has a pretty good ceiling at around 44, and he's had some 30-plus games so far this year. I expect him to have a good one in this particular matchup. Then we're going to get Mitchell Marner for Toronto. He's in a really good spot here. He's actually got the highest ceiling of any of the players at the wing position, and he's also averaging about 15 fantasy points per game. His ceiling is over 50. He's had a lot of 25-point games, 20 to 25-point games lately, and he hasn't really had too many bad games, so I do think he's a really good safe option, and he's a little bit cheaper than some of the other options. Then we're going to look at Kyle Connor here for Winnipeg. He's at $6,500. His average is around 14, and his ceiling is in the mid-30s. He's been pretty solid the last few games, and I hope for that to continue here. Brian Rust is a guy I really like today. His price is a little bit too cheap for what he's been doing. He's been a little bit inconsistent, though, so that is a problem, and he's had some zeros and some very low scores. But his price is cheap. He's averaging around 12 to 13 points, and he has an extremely high ceiling at the low 40s, I think. So he definitely has some upside with the minutes and stuff, and the way that's going for him. Then we're going to look at Keller for Arizona. Now, Keller is a little bit cheaper even, and he's actually been extremely good lately. He's had 3 20-plus fantasy point games in the last 5 games, and his ceiling is in the mid-30s. I think he's got a good opportunity here, averaging 14 fantasy points a game. He doesn't really hurt you too much, usually, and so he's a good value play. Lucas Raymond is the final wing that I've got to take a look at here. He's averaging around 10 fantasy points a game, but his price point is only 51, and he's been, in the last 4 games, he's had 15 or more fantasy points. In the last 5, he's had 14 or more in 4 of them, sorry. And his minutes seem to have, he is playing a lot and doing well. He's had a couple zeros earlier on, and he wasn't as consistent early on, but he's really starting to play well, and his ceiling is in the mid-30s, upper 30s. For defensive players, I've got a few guys here. Cale Maker. Now, he's a pretty expensive defensive player, but for good reason. He's averaging about 18 fantasy points a game and has a 40 to 42 ceiling. I think he's a pretty solid play here. He's been really consistent, scoring over 15 fantasy points quite a few times, or getting really close to 15 in those couple of those games. And so he looks like a pretty safe play. Though I don't typically like to pay up at this position. Sometimes I do, just depending on the quality of the players available. Roman Josi is another guy I like a lot. He's averaging 19 fantasy points a game with a 42 ceiling. He's had some really high-end games. You can see against St. Louis, he had 40 fantasy points, and he's had a bunch of over 20 as well. I think he has the capability to do that tonight. Then we're going to look at Adam Fox, getting a little bit cheaper here at $6,900. His ceiling is pretty good still at 35 fantasy points, and he's been averaging about 16 himself, including a big 46-point game yesterday, which is well above what I feel like his ceiling is today. But that just shows that he has the ability to do it. And then we're going to look at Noah Dobson here. For the New York Islanders here. He's at $6,400. Now his average is around 14, and his ceiling is in the low 30s, maybe the high 20s for this one. He's been pretty decent though lately, and I think he's a good value play. A lot of times I do tend to go cheap at the defensive play position, especially if there's some cheap guys that have potential to score pretty good. And today is one of those days where that definitely feels true. Chris Letang's another guy. He's only averaging about 10 fantasy points a game, though. But he does have a pretty good ceiling, around 25 to 30. And he's had a couple, 15 and 20-point games. He's a little bit more risky, not super ideal, but his price point makes him somebody to take a look at. Then Morgan Riley for Toronto. He looks like he's in a really good spot here. He's had 3 really good games the last 5, though he's had 2 really bad games in those as well for his price point. And his ceiling hits around 30. Maybe a little bit higher than Letang by just a couple points. Then we're going to look at Klingberg for Anaheim. Now, he's an interesting spot here, and he's been pretty solid lately, though he has had a couple off games. He's been getting close to 20 fantasy points in some of these games, and even though his average is really low, around 8.5 to 9, he's been playing well lately and getting some assists and stuff, and he's got a ceiling of around 30 for this matchup. And then finally, last but not least, Drew Doughty for the Kings. He is averaging about 9 to 10 fantasy points a game, and he's been pretty good. I mean, he's been up and down. He hasn't had any huge giant games since early in the year, but he has some upside, and he has a couple goals too. So he averages about around 10, and he has the 32-point ceiling. So overall, I think it's a really good slate. I think there's a lot of value options available, so it's going to make it, doable to, roster lots of different players and stuff like that. So if you have any comments or questions, or if there's anybody that I left off you think I should have not left off, feel free to leave those below. And otherwise, have a nice day, guys.